Hello, dear friends. I'm glad you're here, whether it's your first time or you've returned for another quiet journey. Tonight, I'll tell you one of the strangest, most forgotten, yet deeply human stories. A story of when eating another person wasn't horrifying, when cannibalism was part of ritual, remembrance, and even medicine. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful history like this, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Truly helps me continue creating these stories, just for you. Hello, dear friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether this is your first time listening, or you've returned for another quiet journey into forgotten corners of the past, welcome. Settle in. Let your body rest. Let your mind open just a little, because what we're about to explore is strange and very human. Tonight, we enter the shadows of history, not the grand halls of kings, not the glory of empires, but the strange, silent places that history hides. Forgotten practices, whispers, fragments of truth that most would rather leave untouched. In these shadows, something waits, something real but difficult, something our ancestors understood in ways we've forgotten. Cannibalism, a word that alone makes us recoil. We associate it with madness, desperation, horror. But what if I told you that once it was something else? Something sacred, something necessary, that for much of human history, eating another human being was not always wrong. Sometimes it was right, sometimes it was survival, sometimes it was love. There were times in human history when eating the dead was not an act of savagery, but one of survival, of belief, even of love. Rituals carried out with purpose, with reverence, carried out with tears, carried out by those who didn't want to forget, who believed in connection so deep it went beyond life. For thousands of years, people around the world consumed human flesh, not as monsters, but as believers, mourners, and survivors. They did what they thought was right, even when it now seems unthinkable. And what is more human than that? Doing what must be done, especially when no one else understands. This is not a tale of fear. It is a tale of context, of people doing what they believed they had to do. This is a whispered record, not of horror, but of meaning. A calm walk through some of the most uncomfortable truths about what it has meant to be human. Let it be strange. Let it be uncomfortable. And let it be soft. Let us begin slowly, gently, where it all began, in the rituals of ancient tribes. Part 1. Ritual Cannibalism in Tribal Societies. 5:00, 30:00. Far from cities, beyond the noise of history books, there are stories passed through generations, by firelight, by memory, and by quiet understanding. In the thick, humid rainforests of Papua New Guinea, one such story lived on for centuries. Among the four people, the dead were not buried beneath the soil, nor burned into ash. They were honored through flesh. This practice, called endocannibalism, wasn't rooted in violence or conquest. It was an act of devotion. When a family member died, their body would be carefully prepared and shared among the loved ones they left behind. The act was done not with screams or horror, but with quiet tears. It was a final communion, a last meal together. To the four people, the body was not something to waste. It was a vessel for spirit, a carrier of wisdom, emotion, love. And to eat that body was to ensure nothing was lost. The essence of a mother, a brother, a child. It would live on inside those who consumed it. This wasn't an isolated custom. It echoed in different forms across tribes in the Amazon basin. Among certain groups, warriors who died in battle were not simply mourned. They were consumed so that their strength would not vanish. Eating their flesh was believed to pass on courage, resilience, the power to fight and survive. It may sound foreign now. It may sound grotesque, but think for a moment about how we save a photo or keep a lock of hair or hold on to a favorite piece of clothing. We try to keep something of our loved ones, something physical, something close. For these cultures, the act of eating the dead was the ultimate preservation. In the Aztec Empire, this act rose to a scale beyond the personal. It was not just about remembering. It was about survival of the cosmos. The Aztecs believed the sun demanded blood to rise, that the gods required life to fuel existence, and so they gave it willingly, ritually, often on a massive scale. Sacrificial victims were chosen with ceremony. They were seen not as martyrs, but as honored bridges between the mortal and divine. After the sacrifice, their bodies were sometimes cooked and eaten by priests, nobles, or families, not in gluttony but reverence. The flesh became sacred, a temporary union between human and God. When the Spanish arrived, they wrote of these rituals with shock. They saw them as barbaric, but the Aztecs didn't understand their outrage. To them, not feeding the gods would be the real crime. Letting the sun die, letting the world fall into darkness, that was unthinkable. Across the oceans, the Maori of New Zealand had their own relationship with cannibalism. In war, to eat an enemy was to assert dominance, yes, but also to take on their power, their mana. It was a transfer of essence, a political and spiritual act. Could be symbolic or real. In the islands of Fiji, sometimes called the Cannibal Isles, the practice was ritualized. Ceremonial forks, never touched by human lips, were used to feed flesh to chiefs. Not casually, not greedily, but as part of a spiritual hierarchy that tied land, ancestors, and leadership together. Even in Central Africa, among groups like the Mangbetu, cannibalism had magical significance. Flesh wasn't just matter. It was memory, power, energy. To eat a defeated foe was to trap their spirit, to absorb their will. These were acts rooted in worldview, not appetite. What all these cultures shared was belief that the body was not just meat, that eating was not just nourishment, could be tribute, communion, continuation, and in the stillness of those ancient rituals, something profound echoes. The idea that no one truly dies as long as they are remembered, and sometimes remembered by becoming part of the living. Let's breathe for a moment, and then continue into the world of desperation and what happens when ritual becomes survival. Now we step into a colder place, a darker place, a world where ritual disappears and desperation begins. Here, cannibalism was not a sacred tradition or symbolic act. It was the final option. A terrible line, crossed not in celebration, but in silence. This is the story of survival cannibalism. In the winter of 1846, a group of pioneers known as the Donner Party set out across the American frontier in search of a better life. But as they crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains, a sudden snowstorm trapped them. The snow piled high, the food ran out, and hope froze. They tried everything: boiled hides, leather belts, bark peeled from trees. They huddled together in makeshift shelters as the weeks passed. One by one, members of the group began to die. And when death became a certainty, they made a choice, one that history would never forget. They consumed the flesh of their companions, not in frenzy, not in violence, but with shaking hands and tear-filled eyes. They did it to stay alive, to make it one more day, one more night. And when they were finally rescued, they did not celebrate. They could barely speak. Those who survived the Donner tragedy carried a different kind of wound. Not just physical hunger, but a moral scar. They were not seen as heroes. They were judged, feared, and yet they lived. And living was the price they paid for everything they had to endure. But this was not the first time, nor the last. In 1609, in the early days of the Jamestown colony in Virginia, settlers endured what would come to be called the starving time. Beset by poor planning, drought, and conflict with native tribes, food vanished. And as winter closed in, people began to die. What followed was whispered for generations. Reports of dug-up graves and bones marked by knives. One man, it is said, was executed for killing and eating his wife. Her remains were found boiling in a pot. The desperation had become unbearable, and the line between man and animal, between human and hunger, disappeared. During the brutal siege of Leningrad in World War II, this terrible line was crossed again. For 872 days, the city was cut off from supply lines. Over 1 million people starved. Diaries from that time tell us more than numbers ever could. Children asking for bread in the dark. A mother covering her dead child with a blanket, not to grieve, but to hide the temptation. In silence, some neighbors vanished, and others simply never came back. Those who lived through it said they learned to recognize the look of someone who had eaten, and who would never speak of it again. Then, in 1972, high above the Andes Mountains, a plane carrying a rugby team and their families crashed into the snow. The survivors waited for rescue. They waited for food, but nothing came. Days turned into weeks. Surrounded by the frozen bodies of friends and loved ones, they made a pact. If one of them died, the others would eat, not to dishonor, but to survive, to return home, and that is what they did. When they were finally rescued, their story shocked the world. But unlike others, they spoke, they explained, and many listened. For perhaps the first time, the world began to understand that cannibalism was not always a choice of monsters, but of the desperate, and that sometimes to live is to cross a line no one ever wants to face. Throughout history, other famines, less documented but no less real, pushed people to that edge. In North Korea during the famine of the 1990s, in the aftermath of wars, in forgotten villages and collapsed empires, the story repeats. The plate is empty, the winter is long, and someone does not return. These stories are not meant to terrify. They are meant to remind that human beings will do almost anything to hold on to life. And in the quiet horror of these moments, there is something deeply, hauntingly human. Let us breathe again and walk forward into another strange chapter of our past, where cannibalism was not survival nor sacred, but something even more unexpected, medicine. As we leave behind the world of survival cannibalism, the snowbound cabins, the besieged cities, the starving colonies, we step now into a different sort of darkness, not one born of hunger or fear, but of belief, of science, medicine, and power. We now enter a time when eating human flesh was considered not horrifying, but healing. A time when death was not just mourned, it was harvested. This is the world of corpse medicine, of powdered skulls, of human fat applied like lotion, of blood collected fresh from the body. This is not ancient tribal ritual. This is Europe, the so-called cradle of civilization, the land of kings, cathedrals, and philosophy. And it is here that cannibalism became a prescription. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European physicians often turned to the human body as a source of cure. One of the most famous treatments was mumia, a dark powder made from ground-up mummified human remains. Originally, this meant real Egyptian mummies stolen from tombs and ground into dust. Apothecaries sold it in jars. Doctors mixed it into wine, ointments, or pills. It was believed that ancient flesh, preserved by desert air and sacred rituals, held a kind of mystical vitality, something eternal, something curative. So patients drank it. They rubbed it into wounds. They swallowed it for headaches, for epilepsy, for bleeding gums. But as demand grew, genuine mummies ran out. Enterprising traders began to fake them, drying criminal corpses in ovens, wrapping them in linen, and selling them as ancient relics. The result? People consumed the recently executed, thinking them pharaohs. And it didn't stop there. Executioners, once feared, loathed, and socially excluded, became unlikely healers. After a beheading, they would collect the warm blood and sell it to the crowd. It was thought to contain life force, especially potent for epileptics. In some cities, people came running with mugs. A warm sip of health. Human fat was gathered from the bodies of the hanged, boiled down, and stored in jars. It was applied as salve for muscle aches, joint pain, or wounds. Known as poor man's balm, it was cheaper than foreign ointments and, according to many, more effective. And among royals, the trend turned even stranger. King Charles II of England was said to drink a tonic called the King's Drops, a tincture made from human skulls steeped in alcohol. He believed it helped his vitality, his digestion, even his mind. This wasn't madness. It was medicine, the best of the time. Across Europe, corpse parts became a market. Bones from charnel houses, skulls from plague pits, blood from battlefields. People bought them in pharmacies. They followed the advice of respected doctors and scholars. Even the devout, monks, priests, nuns used these treatments. In some places, cannibalism even became part of political power. To consume the body of the executed was to display victory, to hold their essence, to keep their strength from returning in rebellion. Flesh became not just a cure, but a symbol. This practice, so deeply entrenched, lasted well into the 18th century. And while it began to fade with the rise of modern science, traces lingered. In Germany, a famous text from 1679 titled Pharmacopoeia Medico-Chymica included recipes for medicines made from human blood, bone, and tissue. It was not fringe. It was mainstream. It was endorsed, taught, repeated, and yet, at the very same time, these same societies were horrified by stories from abroad, of islanders eating their dead, of tribal warriors consuming hearts. The same Europe that spread colonial judgments across the world was quietly drinking powdered flesh at home. The irony is vast, the hypocrisy undeniable. But in both cases, whether in ritual, survival, or medicine, the logic was the same. That within the body, there is something worth saving. Something that doesn't die when the heart stops. Something that can be transferred, ingested, preserved. And perhaps that's what's so haunting about medical cannibalism. Not that it happened, but that it happened with calm, with precision, with approval. The next time you pass an old apothecary, or look into the windows of a European cathedral, think about what was once mixed behind those stone walls. Not just herbs and honey, but humanity itself. Let us continue now deeper still into the symbolic, into the spiritual, into a kind of cannibalism that required no chewing, only belief. As we move from the physical into the spiritual, we find ourselves in a place where flesh is not consumed by mouth, but by meaning, where the body is not chewed or boiled, but transformed through metaphor, through belief, through ritual language that goes deeper than logic. We are now entering the realm of symbolic cannibalism. You may already know the most famous example. It happens every day, in chapels and cathedrals, in village churches and grand basilicas. The Eucharist, the central rite of Christianity, is, in essence, a ritual of symbolic consumption. In sacred ceremony, millions take part in an act they may not even fully understand. A reenactment of sacrifice, a meal with the divine. Take this bread, Jesus says, "It is my body. Drink this wine. It is my blood." For billions of believers, this moment is sacred, a mystery, a gift. In the act of taking communion, They symbolically eat and drink the body and blood of Christ, becoming one with him, remembering his sacrifice. In this meal there is memory, there is presence, there is transcendence. But for many centuries this wasn't just metaphor. Entire theological battles were waged over how literal it was. Was it truly the body and blood? Did the bread change into flesh? Did the wine become blood? How could something remain bread and yet be more than bread? The concept of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine are not symbols, but literally transformed, shaped medieval Europe. It split churches, it sent people to trial, created entire sects of faith. The debate over this one idea led to wars, inquisitions, and excommunications. To eat was not merely to remember, it was to participate in mystery. Mystics wrote of ecstatic visions, where they saw the host turn red in their hands. Some claimed they could taste blood. Others believed they were being consumed in turn by the divine. There were stories of miracles, bleeding wafers, wine that refused to spoil. The line between metaphor and manifestation blurred. Saint Catherine of Siena was said to live for weeks on nothing but the Eucharist. She wrote that each communion was a union more real than any human meal, that Christ was within her truly body and spirit. She wrote of divine hunger, of consuming and being consumed, of love so complete it crossed every boundary. And in the art of the Renaissance we see it too. Paintings where angels offer a golden chalice filled with red, where saints hold bleeding hearts, where altars shine not with food but with flesh, sanctified by love. The sacred meal was not just doctrine, it was culture, it was identity. It is cannibalism without violence, a spiritual feast, a symbolic merging, and yet the language remains carnal, intimate, corporeal. But it wasn't only in Christianity. Among indigenous communities in South America, some tribes practiced ritual endocannibalism not for nourishment, but remembrance. When a loved one died, their ashes might be mixed into food or drink. The act was quiet, intimate, a way to keep part of the person alive, to ingest memory, to refuse to let the soul drift away. To modern ears, it may seem unthinkable. But think of what we do. We keep ashes in urns. We wear lockets of hair. We whisper to gravestones. We too long for nearness. We too resist forgetting. We cling to the physical even when the person is gone. In Tibet, sky burials, where the dead are offered to vultures, reflect a similar principle. The body is not wasted. It is given. It is shared. It becomes part of the world. It becomes food for flight. Spirit returned to air. In some African and Pacific cultures, the bones of the dead were kept in homes or worn as jewelry, not as trophies, but as a way of saying, "You are still with me. You are still part of this. You did not disappear." We see this in language too, in poetry, in mourning. "You are in my heart," we say. "I carry you with me." These are metaphors, but they speak to something very real, a desire to take the essence of another into ourselves, to consume not the body, but the memory, the meaning, the life they left behind. We sing songs that say, "Your love keeps me alive." We write letters to the dead. We build shrines, altars, memory boxes. We read the same stories again and again, so the voice that once read them to us never fades. Cannibalism, in its symbolic form, exists wherever people remember, wherever they seek to hold on. And it's no coincidence that so many cultures created rituals around the mouth, around eating, drinking, breathing, because that is how we take in the world. That is how we say, "I need this. I need you. I am not ready to let go." In funerals, we eat together. In mourning, we share meals. Food becomes memory. Scent becomes presence. One taste of a grandmother's pie, a father's favorite tea, and the dead sit beside us again, if only for a moment. And it's not just in sacred texts. It's in fairy tales, in folk stories, in bedtime rituals. I love you so much, I could just eat you up, we say. Sounds sweet, sounds silly, but beneath it is truth. It is language trying to do what flesh cannot, to make love permanent, to make loss endurable, to bridge the gap between what is gone and what remains. Symbolic cannibalism is not about hunger. It is about connection, about holding the ones we've lost, the ones we love, inside of us, not with teeth, but with time, not through body, but through bond. So now, as we prepare to step into the final part of this journey, we must ask, why did it stop? Why did cannibalism, physical, spiritual, symbolic, become the ultimate taboo? What changed? Was it science, morality, or was it something deeper? A fear not of eating the dead, but of acknowledging how much we still want them near. Let us walk one last stretch into the age of silence, of shame, and of forgetting. As we step into the last chapter of this quiet, unsettling journey, we must ask the question that has likely lingered behind every word. Why did it stop? Why did cannibalism, ritual, survival, medicinal, symbolic, vanish from the structures of society and enter the realm of ultimate taboo? What changed? And what does that say about us, about our fears, our rules, our humanity? In truth, the disappearance of cannibalism was not sudden. It was not erased overnight, nor globally. It vanished gradually, over centuries, in waves, under the weight of shifting beliefs, technological advancements, and changing ideas of morality. Let us begin with the most obvious factor, science. With the rise of modern medicine in the 18th and 19th centuries, the old practices of corpse medicine, the powdered skulls, the mumia mixtures, the king's drops, began to look more like superstition than science. The discovery of germs, the circulation of blood, the understanding of disease, all replaced the magical thinking that had once allowed people to believe that blood from a hanged man could cure epilepsy, or that consuming human fat could soothe a broken bone. And as medicine advanced, so too did public health. Sanitization, hygiene, vaccination, these replaced desperation with treatment and death with hope. The body of the dead, once a possible cure, became a possible contaminant. And that fear changed everything. But beyond science, there was something else rising, the moral revolution of modernity. With the Enlightenment came new codes of ethics, a new kind of respect for individual dignity, a view of the human body not as resource but as sacred in a secular way. Laws followed. By the 19th century, cannibalism, even in its symbolic or accidental forms, was becoming not just unthinkable but illegal. Grave robbing was punished harshly. Autopsies were regulated. The medical market in body parts dried up. Colonialism played a role, too. As European powers spread across the globe, they encountered cultures where cannibalism, especially ritual cannibalism, still existed. And instead of trying to understand, they judged, they documented, they condemned. In books, in exhibitions, in lectures and newspapers, European explorers and missionaries described cannibal tribes as savage, animalistic, monstrous. They made cannibalism the symbol of the uncivilized. It became a weapon, a reason for conquest, for colonization, for civilizing the world. And yet, the same societies that pointed fingers had, only generations earlier, drunk blood from skulls in royal courts. The projection was powerful. Cannibalism became the ultimate other, the act that separated the modern man from the primitive, the enlightened from the damned. It wasn't just discouraged. It was buried, denied, forgotten on purpose. But buried things do not vanish. They settle in the ground, beneath the foundations. And sometimes they rise again in myth, in fiction, in fear. Think about it. How many horror stories involve cannibalism? How many serial killers, monsters, zombies, ghouls, legends? Cannibalism, though rejected in practice, has become one of the great obsessions of our nightmares. In film and literature, we explore it not because we believe in it, but because we fear it. Because some part of us still recognizes that to consume another human being is not only horrific, it is intimate. It is irreversible. It touches something primal, something older than speech. Why do we feel such revulsion? Why does the thought make us flinch? It is not just biology. It is identity. The body to us is sacred. It is where our name lives, our memory, our face. To eat a body is to erase its story. To treat a person as meat is to undo everything we believe makes us human. And yet, we also know that not long ago, in the snow, in the desert, in the jungle and cathedral, people did it. Thoughtfully, desperately, lovingly, ritualistically, and they weren't monsters. They were people like us, people who needed to remember, people who needed to survive. We may never truly escape the tension between the horror and the logic of it, between the old ways and our modern rules. And maybe we shouldn't, because in that tension lies something real, a recognition that humanity is complex, that survival sometimes demands the unthinkable, that love sometimes speaks in the language of the body, that grief sometimes needs ritual, and that history is stranger and more intimate than we like to admit. We live in a world that claims to be past cannibalism, and perhaps on the surface it is, but in the stories we tell, the myths we build, the memories we carry, it remains. Every time you say, "I carry you in my heart," every time you taste a memory through food, or feel the absence of a body more strongly than words can explain, that ancient echo stirs. It does not call you to eat. It does not ask you to repeat, but it reminds you, we are animals wrapped in story. We are flesh wrapped in ritual. We are fragile beings who long to hold on, and sometimes holding on becomes consuming. And so, dear listener, as this journey comes to a close, may you take with you not the fear of the past, but its complexity, its humanity. May you remember that the line between the sacred and the profane, the civilized and the primitive, is thinner than we think. And may you sleep not in horror but in wonder, knowing that even the darkest parts of history were lit by the same fire we carry now, the fire of meaning, of connection, of being human. Sleep well, let the past rest, let your breath slow, and remember, we are stories, we are rituals, we are memory. Good night.